Thank you very much. Excellent. Well, I'm very happy to be here today. So just to tell you quickly about the kind of work that I do a little bit more broadly, is that I do work in non-commodity markets. So anything that is off the commodity market. So this could be on any kind of what we refer to often as differentiation. It could be something that's sold as a local product, or it's branded with your farm name, or it's something that's certified organic, or all of the other kinds of certifications that we have now. So I look specifically at those kinds of markets and then evaluate both the farm and ranch profitability impacts of sales through those kinds of markets, and then also try to look at how certain kinds of investments, like what the Minnesota Department of Agriculture is doing, which is super cool. I wish we had a program like that in Colorado. How that kind of investment actually supports rural communities and economies. So that's kind of what I do broadly. And before I started at Colorado State University, and actually before I went back and did my PhD, I worked as one of the first agricultural economic development specialists in New York State, of course, dairy country. And so through that, I helped to start a number of value-added dairy businesses that I'm going to talk about later today. So you're going to get to hear more about some of these sort of New York anecdotes towards the end of the presentation. But what I wanted to really start with is talking about some general trends that we see around maybe some of these larger markets. And the one that I wanted to start with, which of course is something that dairy farmers don't generally like to hear about, are these sort of growth in the non-dairy plant-based alternatives. Of course, this has been in the news a lot, right, because of the labeling issues right now that we have federally. Um, but I think it is important to note that we do have pretty substantial growth in these non-dairy plant-based alternatives, right? And if you think about it, I don't know when last time you looked in the dairy aisle of the grocery store, right? But you can see that many of these many of these dairy companies like Organic Valley, right? They now have a soy line. I'm guessing people have seen that, right? So when was that cut? Okay, it was just whacked. Okay. Well, till recently they had a soy line, right? And we are seeing that there are these changes right now that are happening, right? Dannon is another one. So anyway, it's something worth noting. However, this market overall is still relatively small, right? And so even if we have this expansion, and you may hear about it in the news, we don't want to overblow the extent to which it's really cannibalizing dairy sales. Kind of important to note. The other thing that I think is really important is this last bullet here, right? That 9 in 10 households that purchase these plant-based alternatives also buy cow's milk products. And that among those purchasing both, their cow's milk choice tends to be organic or these premium tier of milk products, right? And when we talk about some of these premium tier of milk products, what I'm talking about are these differentiated products, right? So things that are organic, grass-fed, right? The ultra-filtered, lactose-free, A2 milk, which has been growing. Is anyone familiar here with A2? Okay, so that's something you've all been talking about here. We're just getting our first A2 dairies in Colorado, so it's been interesting to see some trends. And actually, I just noticed in my local grocery store that I now see A2 milk in the store. So anyway, then these new value-added and niche dairy products are slowing the rate of decline of milk sales, right? And so this is where we are really seeing some high areas of growth, especially in this highly competitive market, which is important to note. So I just wanted to touch on organic milk. The global market value of organic dairy milk product was 18 billion in 2017, projected to grow by 28 billion by 2023. And there's lots of information out there that I'm sure you all are familiar with about cost of production, right? And we can do some, I think, pretty good work right now understanding what the financial implications are of that kind of transition to organic. And so North America is home to one of the largest organic dairy markets. And really, we just see continued growth in these markets, which I think is really interesting. And this is something that Farm Bureau put out with USDA Ag Marketing Service data. And so here, what you can see is the organic milk in pounds, right? And over here, what we're looking at is conventional milk in pounds. So what we're seeing is that overall, even though we see continued growth in organic, right, it's still sort of a drop in the bucket relative to what we see in terms of conventional milk. But I think one thing that's really interesting if we look at retail, right? And so just sorry, I'm going to be a little bit geeky here for a second, but many of you probably know this. So as an average American, we spend about half of our food dollars on purchases for things that we make at home. Right. So these are things when you go to the grocery store, you go to Costco, and you go and purchase products that you're going to cook at home. So that's about a half of our dollars that we spend on food. The other half is spent on food away from home. And so, it's really interesting to note that mix because we kept seeing that the amount that we were spending away from home was going up and up, but now we see about a leveling off in terms of that expenditure. So I just mentioned that to keep in mind because when we talk about the retail market share, it's only half of those food dollars. The other thing that's important to note is the kind of retail that we're talking about, because even though historically most of our food dollars were spent at traditional grocery stores, we really see that's changing. And especially we see that's changing for the new generation that's coming in, right? So for the baby boomer generation, we still see that about 2/3 of their dollars are spent at grocery stores. And I'm going to show some slides on this in a few minutes. But for the younger generation, right, so those in their 20s, we see that they're actually spending only about 1/3 of their dollars at retail stores. So I wanted to give a little bit of context when we talk about retail. But so what you can see here is that when we're looking at the market share for organic commodities, you can see that organic milk, right, has taken over the largest share in terms of other commodities of organic and non-organic, right? So that's all interesting to note. The other thing is when we want to look at premium, right? So how much additional revenue essentially are you getting on a per unit basis? You can see that dairy and eggs really command the highest premiums, right? So you can see that you get about a 72% premium over non-organic prices in the organic market. Again, higher for eggs, but even with yogurt, you're getting about 52%. And keep in mind that when I talked about that sort of differentiation earlier, many people, what they're doing is they take organic and then they also take local. And so they have sort of multiple things that they can use to differentiate that product, right? So this is only for organic. You may actually be able to get a higher premium if you sort of couple some of these things. Okay, we've seen some real growth in interest in grass-fed milk, right? This is something that I think we're seeing increasingly on different labels. And I of what the interest here is that there has been some research that's come out. This is something that Organic Valley has been using. You can see the reference over there in the bottom left, right? There is some research that talks about the health benefits associated with grass-fed milk. And so many of the companies are sort of using this. So I think what we're going to see is continued growth and awareness by consumers about this as sort of an alternative, right? And I think that is fueled by some research. Of course, not all research provides some kind of evidence. But what you want to note here is that so this is data from 2016, and you can see that in there grass-fed, and this isn't referring specifically to dairy, right? This is just sort of grass-fed in general. We're seeing pretty low sales levels still. So even if we look at the percent change, right, we're still starting from a pretty small point, right, of total sales. So I just wanted to sort of set the stage to talk about that there is sort of growth that we're seeing in some of these products that are labeled with different dairy attributes, right? And I just wanted to highlight the organic and grass-fed. Now what I'd like to turn our attention to is some of the changes that we're seeing in terms of dairy product trends specifically. So in terms of some of the top trends that we were hearing about in 2018 and moving into 2019, what is this good for you category, right? People are very interested in sort of what's healthy. And many of these good for you kinds of things are things that I think are positive for the dairy industry, right? Probiotics, high protein, sugar reduction. We see growth and interest in these clean labels. And I don't know, has anyone ever been to this Go Clean Label certified website? Are people aware of this? Well, it's really interesting because you can go to this website And all of our retailers, right, they have lists of what they consider to be sort of transparently or clean labeled products, right? So this is where they literally have lists of the kinds of ingredients that would be included in a product that would make it so that it could be considered a clean label. And I think part of this is driven by the fact that there's increasing interest from consumers in having products that are sort of whole foods or things that they've heard of and they know where they come from. Um, and so this is a way to actually certify, right, that there are these clean things in here, right? So as I said, food products containing natural, familiar, simple ingredients, easy to recognize. And then a continued trend, and I think this is something we've seen over several years, right, but that's continuing, is around these portable products, right? Things we can grab and go, right, that are very convenient, right? We see growth in this sort of convenience trend continuing. So, looking specifically at yogurt, right? We saw 8.8 billion in sales in 2018 and expected to reach 9.8 billion in 2022. Dannon, Chobani, and General Mills control 75% of the market, right? And this is pretty incredible, right? When you think about Chobani, right, is still a relatively new company. I mean, I remember I was in the county next to where Chobani set up its headquarters and was working as an agricultural economic development specialist when they got started. And who would have anticipated, right, the tremendous growth that they've had? Um, Yogurt, the yogurt market is generally divided into two categories, right? Refrigerated yogurt, which is the spoonable kind, and then refrigerated yogurt drinks, right? Again, highly portable, following some of those trends. So we see on average that yogurt is eaten by 55% of adults. And one of the interesting things is that even though our per capita consumption of yogurt has grown, we see that we're still way behind in North America what they're consuming for yogurt in Europe, as an example, right? So that would at least, since we like to follow these, right, these trends in the Mediterranean diet and all these kinds of things, that it seems like there's still room for the yogurt market to expand in North America. Um, Consumers increasingly prefer a regular yogurt. So even though we've seen growth in the Greek yogurts and things like that, that there's that the having, maybe that was a little bit of a fad, and we see this movement back to the regular yogurt. And most yogurt consumers eat or drink 4 to 11 servings a month, right? And so, as I said, I think that this is a number we'll see continue to grow over the next years. So this is the per capita consumption of cheese now in the U.S., right? So I'm switching over to cheese. So you can see we do continue to basically increase our cheese consumption. I feel like I've really made a dent in this personally. And this is what we're looking at in terms of the sales of the leading natural sliced cheese brands. So the natural sliced, if you get the sliced cheddar, the sliced Gouda, right? It's this is what they refer to it as in sort of the retail industry, but it's probably most of what you all are eating at home in terms of that sliced cheese. Right. So one of the things that's really interesting here is this private labeled cheese, right? I'm not showing you the changes, but really we have seen tremendous growth in this. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with what a private labeled product is, if you go to a grocery store right now, like I'll give the example of Whole Foods, right? If you've been to a Whole Foods and you see the 365 brand, right? That's Whole Foods private label brand. So essentially, even though it may be exactly the same product that you're getting from somewhere else, they're having it co-packed, right? Or they may actually own the facility, but if it's co-packed, essentially they're having a company make it for them and put their label on it, right? So again, sometimes these products can be exactly the same thing, manufactured at the same facility using exactly the same milk, but they have this different label on it, and that label is how they're differentiating that product to consumers. The advantage of the private label is that for these large retailers, they can purchase this product, in huge volumes, and so they can take advantage of economies of scale. Right, it makes sense. And just to say this, because I haven't included this per se in lines later, but I think often people don't think about when they're starting something or they're trying to think about market opportunities, actually trying to access some of these private labeled brands, right? You may not be the best marketer, right? And this may be an opportunity for you to think about actually how to move more of your product in stores. So I thought that this was a good quote from Supermarket News, right? And this is talking about the evolution of cheese into a packaged snack food option has led to the introduction of different types of cheeses, sometimes with new fangled flavor profiles, right? And it's going on. But I wanted to really draw your attention to this bottom piece here. The demand for novel and artisanal cheeses has allowed smaller label cheeses to claim their place at the table. And I think this is really important to keep in mind because I will just say, as an overall trend in the food industry, what we see is that even though we keep talking about sort of consolidation that's taken place, right? I'm sure this is something you are all familiar with. We've seen consolidation in every segment of the supply chain. We are also seeing this polarization occur, right? Where we see growth in the large, but we're also seeing growth in the small. So I do some work in local foods, right? Think about farmers markets, right? 10, 15 years ago, did we have the number of farmers markets that we have? Microbreweries, right? A great example. Look at the proliferation of these microbreweries or micro distilleries that we have, right? So even though we have that consolidation and the folks that are getting bigger, right, and can take advantage of economies of scale, there is also a space in the market for these sort of smaller brands. However, they have to figure out how to differentiate themselves to be profitable. And I'll keep that. So cheese, right? In terms of what we're seeing is some of the really hot trends and that we're moving out of 2018 into 2019. One is these flavored cheeses, right? And we really see continued growth in those. 2/3 of households purchased over 283 million pounds of flavored cheese in 2016. We see this healthy food flavor note, right? So you're eating yogurt, which is, or excuse me, a cheese, which is, healthy in and of itself, but it also has chia, or quinoa seeds in it, right? So you're getting that added health benefit and people feel, right, good for you foods. The hotter, the better. I mean, I do not know who wants to buy cheese with ghost peppers, but I read in two different industry publications that this is one of the hot trends in 2019, which, again, does not sound like fun to me, but and then these farmhouse cheeses, right? These specialty cheeses, especially something that can be a little bit more unique to a particular region, and this has to do with the local foods trend, right? People are really interested in sort of these placed baked kind of products, right? That they travel somewhere and they get to taste the local culture. We see growth and interest in Cork, right? Here's an example here, this low-fat, soft cheese. And then also trends around doing some washed rinds. Of course, if you want to be a really good marketer, not only are you going to do is look at these current trends, but you're going to be able to anticipate the trends in the future, right? Which is the much more difficult thing to do. Okay, so with that, what I want to do is sort of transition away from thinking about these trends in terms of the what's going on with milk and differentiated milk, and moving away from thinking about the trends in the products. I want to really think about, so you're thinking about diving in, right? So what does that mean? What do you want to really consider before you before? So the first thing is, what is your niche? Right. When I say that I think there's a place in the market for some of these smaller, highly differentiated products, that means you need to come up with a really good story and rationale for what makes you defensibly unique. Right. And defensibly is really important. Just because you say you're unique doesn't make you unique. And the other thing to keep in mind here is that it's not necessarily what's true that's important. What's important is what your customer thinks is true, right? So again, thinking about the trends in organic and grass-fed and things like that, right? Whether or not organic is better, right, by some objective term, really doesn't make a difference to me, right? What makes a difference is, does the customer think it's better, and is the customer willing to pay a premium for that? Right? Those are the things we want to think about. And that's what I really care about when I'm trying to think about how do we support farmers and ranchers. So how do you communicate that value to your customer, right? Nobody buys a John Deere because it's the cheapest tractor on the market, right? They buy a John Deere because, nothing runs like a John Deere, right? And they want the neighbors to see the John Deere and all that kind of stuff. So again, the emphasis is not on the product itself, but on the customer's perception of that product. And it's really, really important to keep in mind. I work a lot with our wheat growers out in Colorado, and I'll tell you, nothing pisses them off more than the fact that if you go and look at your bread in the grocery store, right, that many of them are labeled now as GMO free. Well, we have no commercially available GMO varieties of wheat on the market, right? So again, it's deceptive, right? But the consumer has heard all this buzz about GMOs, and so they're now willing to pay a premium for GMO free bread, even though GMO bread doesn't exist, right? So anyway, something to keep in mind. So the idea is to secure a place in your customer's mind, right, for your product based on some factor or factors that are going to differentiate your product, right? Somebody can come and probably replicate what you do, right? But there's a reason that your customer is not going to shift to this other product, and you need to figure out what that is. And again, especially when you're small and starting off, it can be based on sort of your family, right? The people know about your farm. It can be based on where you're located, right? It can be based on lots of different things, but you really have to spend some time and think what that is, right? So like what makes you that red apple there? Um, and so when you want to think about what you're going to be known for or what makes you defensively unique, right? You may be producing a product that for some reason you can produce better than other people, right? And that can be based on maybe you have a particular skill set where you just know how to do something better. Maybe you have a kid who went and somehow started dating a cheesemaker in France, right? And now wants to move to Minnesota. So I'm just, making things up, but those are the kinds of things you want to think about. Maybe you have access to unique ingredients for some reason, right? In Colorado, we have lots of these microclimates, right? And that allows us to have some highly differentiated products because we have a very small space where certain products can be grown. You have a unique access to a varietal, and I believe that this is something that's happened here with some research that's been funded, for example, from U of M. Many universities are doing this through breeding programs, for example. Terroir, right? So a sense of place, again, that you're in a particular place where people are interested. And I think microbreweries have taken advantage of that to some extent. The brand, you've just done a great job on branding your product. Packaging. One example, in talking about those convenient products, I talked to someone who it's an Irish farmer who makes this egg. It's like a raw egg product, and they were the first ones to put it in like a plastic container that you can screw on the top. Right? Now, somebody else can replicate that, but they were the first ones to think about it. And now, you make your eggs, you can kind of pour it in and you can screw back on the top. And I think that there's a number of, especially urban customers, that like that kind of convenience. Availability, right? So especially, this is less true in the dairy industry, but where we have people who are putting in greenhouses. I actually, one of the farms I'm going to talk about later, one of the dairy operations actually is a seasonal dairy. And so what they tried to do was really market the fact that this was a cheese that they make this one kind of cheese that you actually can't get year round, right? And so when it's actually available, that they've built up this excitement for that. Personal relationships, right? So your network, that's really important. It can also, again, be based on the farm and people want to support a particular farm. They've watched the kid grow up. They think this dairy does a great job. And then the customer experience, right? And that can be based on lots of different things. I will tell you that I get my milk delivered to my house in the morning, and it's not every morning, once a week. And it's a great experience to be able to have, right? That level of convenience and the level of customer service. They actually let me change my order up until 9 a.m. on the day it's delivered, which is pretty incredible. I have no idea how they make that work. So the second thing that I would recommend you consider is, are there opportunities to co-pack before making large capital investments? And Jolene was kind enough to give me a list of the dairy plants in Minnesota. I didn't include the whole list here because it's very long. But making a capital investment to do processing is expensive, right? And it's very risky, as I'm sure our friends at Minnesota Department of Ag can attest to. If there are opportunities to work with an existing facility to test the product and make sure that there is a market for it before you make that investment, right? That is, I think, almost always the way to go, right? First of all, it's going to make you much more attractive to a bank and to a lender, right? Because you now have this proven track record. You have customers, what the customers are willing to pay. I think a lot of times when I start with some of these new businesses, what they try to do is, they get a letter from like Kroger saying, yes, we're going to buy this product. Well, that's all well and good, but that letter is pretty meaningless, right? There's no contract in place there. So this is actually like putting some skin in the game. Now, oftentimes, even if a dairy processor is not a co-packer per se, right? They manufacture their own product. Sometimes they're willing to work with you. And I think you have to go and have those kinds of conversations as a starting point. And and just sort of or a few examples. One is that in Colorado, we went through and through a Freedom of Information Act request, got a list of all of the facilities in the state that have permits. That's called a farm product handler's license. I might be messing this up, but I've done this in both New York and Colorado now. I would assume something similar could be done in Minnesota. And so you can actually get a list of all of the businesses that currently are purchasing product from farmers and ranchers, right? And from this list, then we've been able to actually go through and figure out where there may be some opportunities. So just to tell you, there are grants that are available and I mean, you guys have it at your state, which is awesome, but there's also grants that are available at the federal level to the extent that they're already doing something well, right? That they may be able to make an additional investment at a fraction of the cost. And that may be enough of a carrot for them to do this, right? So you really want to go and have some conversations with them. There's obviously complexities here, right? Especially if you want to be able to identify it's your milk, you're going to have to work with someone who's willing to segregate your product. Not always the easiest thing to do. But again, I think through conversations, we've been able to make this work in a number of cases. So one of the cases that I thought I would tell you about is Redgate Farm, which is owned by Bruce and Nancy Rivington. They're one of the largest grass-based dairies in New York State. So they're milking, now it's New York, right? So they're smaller dairies, but they're milking about 1,000 cows, or they were at the time when they started this. And so, Bruce Rivington was very concerned at some of what was sort of what he was seeing as some of the fluctuation in pricing, and he really thinking about what were some opportunities to develop a value-added product. And so what we were able to do as a starting point, this is when I worked as an agricultural economic development specialist. So I went and got a grant from Northeast SARE. You also have access to SARE funds. These come through the Farm Bill. And I was able to write it as somebody who worked for Cornell Cooperative Extension. And we got this grant to essentially bring together a group of dairy farmers to do a feasibility study to look at developing this grass-based dairy product. And so that's where we started. We also did get a USDA about in a second here. I will tell you that what ended up happening, we formed a company that came out of this SARE grant called Creamhill Dairy Farms. Creamhill was one of the original Holstein herds. I don't know if anyone knows that history, but interesting. And so the group that started actually is not the group that ended up together. And one of the reasons that the group didn't end up together was that they really couldn't agree on some of the standards for like what constituted a grass-based dairy. And so there were some tensions there. The business ended up being bought out by Bruce and Nancy Rivington. But if anyone wants to talk about that more, I'd be happy to. So this group decided that there was a market opportunity here. And so they actually are independent. Right. And I think, and I've tried to do something similar with, especially in Colorado, right? Almost all of our dairies are part of DFA Dairy Lee. And we really were not able, it's much more difficult and I think risky for those members of that cooperative to figure out how to do some of the co-packing. And I'd be happy to talk about, at least in my experience, why that's the case. Some of you may have more expertise in this. But because Bruce was an independent, he was allowed basically to divert some of his milk, right? And that's sort of what made some of this possible, because when we're starting off doing a value-added product, right, it's hard to be able to use all of your milk, right? Because you probably don't have that kind of market built up initially. And so what he did, we started talking to Queensboro Dairy Farm. So Queensboro is an independent processor that was about, I would say, 50 miles from his farm. They make this fantastic butter. It's wonderful, right? This great butter. But as you can see here, they don't really market it very well, right? That is not a pretty container, right? And it's also 2 pounds of butter. And I would say that especially since 80% of our population in this country lives in urban areas, right, with small kitchens, most people are not buying 2-pound tubs of butter, right? Although they're obviously making a mistake. So the only place you could get this butter is going to this really tiny little store in Canastota, New York, right? Which those of us who love butter do, but most people are not doing that. So we started talking to them for a while about would they be willing to make this butter for the Rivingtons right under their label, and eventually they agreed to do this, and they agreed to segregate the milk. And the way that we made this work is that essentially the Queensboro still bought milk from the Rivingtons, right? So they still, that transaction didn't change. They charged an extra fee for the segregation of the milk, and then essentially Bruce and Nancy bought back the butter, right? So we had to come up with a per unit cost for the butter. So I mentioned about the USDA grant. One of the things that we quickly realized was that Queensboro, we had to start by hand packing the butter, which was very labor consuming and expensive. And so what we decided to do, we wanted to get a grant to subsidize the cost of buying a filler. I think I actually have the filler. And so we were able to do that. We got what at the time was called a Rural Business Enterprise Grant, and now is called a Rural Business Grant. These are through USDA Rural Development. So municipalities are eligible to apply for these. Municipalities, so we got $100,000. Municipality gets this money. They have to basically rent the equipment for, I think it's a third of the cost of that piece of equipment back to the company, right? But it's a pretty good deal, third of the cost, right, over the life of the equipment. And then the county or the municipality actually gets that money back, and they were able to turn that into, I think, an ag revolving loan fund or something that was going to support the community, right? So it's a really great program that is really underutilized, along with a lot of these other great rural development programs. So anyway, this is how the company started. Developed this label, right? And actually, we developed the label as part of that SARE grant. So we're able to really do a lot with that SARE grant, which I think was only about $15,000. When I was there, we just started doing butter. They've now diversified. They do creme fraiche and I think a few other things. And they've actually now, because they were able to sort of prove the market through this co-packing, they've now built their own creamery at the farm. And so this is a picture on the bottom here of some equipment. And this is where, if you go onto their website now, you can see mostly they're focused on sales in New York State and that region, right? And of course, given the market size, that's pretty easy to do there. But they actually do have their butter in some places in California. I think there's a specialty cheese shop in Berkeley, for example, right, where that carries their butter. Never seen that label before, right? So where to actually make the creamery work is they helped Siggy's yogurt get started, right? So Siggy was actually in New York City, right? And he was starting to, out of his kitchen, manufacture this yogurt. And he was trying to figure out a place where he could do it at a little bit more scale. And so he looked around and he was trying to figure out, like, well, where can we actually do this, right? And he found out that there was this creamery in, this location in Norwich, New York, which is pretty rural. And so he started making it there. He basically paid Evans to make this product for him. Now, he had some other challenges, right? Because Whole Foods found out about the product, and then it sort of blew up, and Evans was too small to do the scale that he needed. And so he had some challenges, right, where he grew too quickly, which is a whole other story. But I think what I want to say here is that I think both the Evanses, right, and also Siggy's really thought about what is their competitive advantage, right? So Siggy had this idea for a product. He didn't go and like buy a bunch of dairy cows, right, and think, okay, I'm going to go and build my own processing facility right away. He said, I've got this great idea. I'm a really good yogurt maker, and I've got this great recipe. Who can I find who can help me actually make this product, right? And so it's really important to think about what you're good at. I also just wanted to highlight, since we're talking about Siggy's, right, another great example of a company that's experienced tremendous growth, right? They capture a lot of these buzzwords, right? We talk about the differentiation, so it's important to think about, and they capture a lot of these different kinds of ways to differentiate their product in a very sort of clean looking label, right? Because what I think is happening, a lot of the smaller businesses or startups that I work with, they just kind of throw every logo on there, right? They put everything on there and it's just too much. I think consumers are just overwhelmed. And they've done a great job thinking about how to convey why you should purchase their product, again, in this very, very clean kind of way. One other thing I thought I'd highlight, and I'm sorry I'm inundating you with stories from upstate New York, but it's what I know, and Colorado, but that's sort of been a different beast. So Faye yogurt. So I was there when Faye decided that they were going to build a big U.S. facility, and I can tell you that the reason that we got them in New York, and it was really two main reasons. And one is, of course, the demand, right? I mean, that the corridor from Boston down to, well, Philadelphia, DC area, but beyond, right? That is not something you can just replicate. But the other reason that they moved to Johnstown specifically is that there was this overbuilt wastewater treatment facility. And that wastewater treatment facility was overbuilt because this used to be a big tannery industry right in this spot. So I wanted to highlight this because I think one of the things we always sort of think, okay, we need to build something new. Whereas we have all of these assets in our communities that are underutilized. And so really thinking about what are the kind of assets we have in our community that are underutilized that we can take advantage of. Again, FIA is an extreme example, but I think the fact that they found this wastewater treatment facility, right, was important. Okay, the third thing I wanted to highlight is that nobody is good at everything, right? Which we all know. But it's really, really important to keep in mind if you're thinking about starting a value added dairy, right? Most people are not great farmers and great value added cheesemakers, right? Those are very, very different skill sets, right? Just because they all involve dairy does not make them like a one size fits all thing. And so if you are really going to open a value added business and you're doing it yourself, right? You're not going to go and do co-packing somewhere. You need to find a partner, right? You really need to find a partner. And so this is a company that a business I worked with, Meadowood Farms. It's a sheep's milk dairy. They milk sheep. And they, at first, right, they thought, okay, well, we're just going to take the farm manager and make them into a cheesemaker. That did not work, right? And so they had to go out and actually do some calls and some advertising to find a really high-end cheesemaker, right? Especially because for them, they really wanted to sell to this high-end clientele to be able to get a significant premium kind of product. Luckily, there are lots of like cheese making programs around the country, right? So if this is something you're really serious about doing, there's places that you can reach out to, right? And I think there are, I mean, I actually last week got a call from somebody who was looking to find an operation to pair up with, right? They want to do something on farm. We have a chef who just won a James Beard Award, which is a pretty big deal in the Denver region. And he just opened a sheep's milk dairy goat's milk dairy. And he again advertised to get somebody to actually help him to make this product, right? So, and also for a farm manager, but that's separate. So anyway, I think not everybody is. That's really important to keep in mind. The other thing, and this is again a lesson we can take from what's happened with this microbrewery industry, is that if you find somebody good, you have to incentivize them to stay. You cannot pay a good yogurt maker or a cheese maker an hourly rate and expect that they, if they're any good, are not just going to leave you right as soon as they get a better opportunity. And what we've seen in the microbrewery industry is that many of these brewers, right, the beer owners of the beer, I don't know, the beer store, right, the beer brand or whatever, what they do is they actually make the brewer a partner, right? And that's how you get them to stay, right? You got to get them skin in the game. They want the business to succeed as much as you do. And that's because, we've just had so much growth. We don't have enough of these really well-trained beer makers. Thank you. My language is fantastic. Okay. And then the last thing I just wanted to talk about is that, you need to identify a market opportunity and think about the supply chain, right? And that supply chain piece goes a little bit into what I was trying to talk about that we're really changing how people are buying food to cook at home, right? And so you need to understand that a little bit. So where people shop is changing. It's increasingly diversified. There's growing interest in local, right? But identifying this market supply chain is so important. So on the left here, this is talking about trip dynamics, right? And this is trips going to the grocery store, and this is from 2018 data. So what's interesting here to see is that we're seeing growth in the dollars that are spent per trip, but we're seeing less frequent trips to the grocery store, right? And now keep in mind that growth in dollars per trip is not necessarily due to the fact that people are buying more, right? They may be buying premium products, right? And then this is also what I was mentioning, where if we look at this swing generation in World War II, the blue here represents non-supermarket shopping, and the green is supermarket shopping, right? And this is just based on where their primary shopping is. So 2/3 of the swing generation of World War II, right, they're shopping at grocery stores. It's exactly the opposite for that I generation of millennials, right? So we're really shifting what we purchase and where we purchase it. This is a study, we do this every 5 years with the Colorado Department of Agriculture, where we ask a representative sample questions all about their perceptions of food and agriculture, and we ask them questions about where they shop. And so the 2016 is the most recent data I have. So here, this question is where, if people shopped at these locations for food at any point in 2016, right? So even if they just shopped there once, it's included here. So you can see that, 94% of people went to the grocery store at some point in 2016. What's interesting is that over 50% of the people went to farmers markets, right? I would never have thought a number was that high. You can see that 10% of people had home delivered products, right? I mean, I don't have the data previously, but I would imagine that's a pretty significant growth. Health food stores, right? Over 60% of people. So I think what I want you to get from this is that the number of different kinds of locations where people are shopping, it's really proliferating. We're just seeing tremendous diversification in the kinds of stores where people shop. Now, this slide asks about the share of household food dollars spent at each of the source, right? So what you can see is that over 50% is still spent at grocery stores, right? But now going back to this farmers market example, we see almost 4% here, but this is 4% of about probably $11 billion, right? So it's not nothing, right? Especially if you think about the number of people that are selling at farmers markets. And I'm sorry to keep highlighting farmers markets, but the nice thing about having at least some piece of what you do at the beginning, starting at farmers markets, is that you get direct feedback from your customers, right? So it's kind of like, how when you go to a grocery store, if you want to sample a product, you have to pay to do that. So you actually have to pay to sit there and give away your product for free. It's kind of a way to do that where you're actually at least getting a little bit of money, right? Probably not very much, but a little bit of money and getting some of that direct feedback. Of course, you're only getting it then from farmers market shoppers, but they may be some of the more forgiving. So everybody knows that Amazon purchased Whole Foods, right? And we think, okay, well, why did Amazon purchase Whole Foods, right? It's great. We get prime delivery, it gets right delivered to your house, right? Why didn't they just stick with that model? Why did they have to transition to bricks and mortar? And what we see now is pretty clear evidence that though Americans are willing to shift some of what they're purchasing to online sales, that it's very dependent on the product and the commodity. And so what we see that's going to be happening in terms of like the Whole Foods stores, and I recently was talking to them about this, is that we're going to see this center of the store, I think, disappear. And what these stores are going to become are just the perimeter, right? So these are things like bakery, deli, meat, produce, seafood. These are things that you can kind of grab and go. The pre-made meals that people can take, right? An apple is not an apple, right? We've all had apples. Just because you order an apple does not mean it's a good apple, right? Whereas if you order a box of Cheerios, it's basically the same thing. It doesn't matter where you get it from, right? So the things that we actually want to see something about some kind of quality connotation, right? Those are what's more likely to be in these stores. And so what you can see up here, if you look at the opportunity here, so the e-commerce for food and beverage was 13 billion in 2018, right? This is in 2018. But we see that number is probably going to increase, but it's not going to be necessarily for all products, right? It's going to be for some of these specific products that people are sort of willing to purchase online. Yeah. So, I'm sorry. Repeat the question. Okay, so the question is that I have dairy in center of store for what are the implications for dairy? My guess, although I don't know this for sure, is that people are going to be more willing to purchase products that aren't differentiated from places online and things like that, right? Because if I'm buying it from if I buy Organic Valley milk as an example, right? Organic Valley milk, I assume, is Organic Valley milk, regardless of the store where I buy it. If there's some kind of product that's going to be more differentiated, right? I would think that that's something I would get here, right? So not to say organic value is not differentiated, but it's going to be the same product regardless of where I buy it. That is my guess. Now, that being said, I think the thing that makes milk different is milk is one of those staple items that people always want in the house. So people run out of it, right? It's one of the reasons when you go into a grocery store, where is the milk located? The back, right? Because it makes you walk through it. And also of the lost leader concept, right? It's something that people pay attention to pricing. And so they know if it changes. So my guess is that you're going to have some changes in where people buy milk, but that there's going to be something in the store as well because people probably want to come and grab it. But again, I think in terms of if you think about the amount of space that's devoted, I don't know that we'll have the same amount of sort of more non-differentiated items that we have currently. That would be my guess, but it would be, I didn't ask Whole Foods that question. We just met with them. Okay, and so I wanted to just end, we're talking about some of these market opportunities, and we're also talking about, thinking about differentiation. Local foods has experienced some real growth in the U.S. Was estimated 8.7 billion in 2015, and I apologize, we don't have more recent data on this, so the 2017 Ag Census should be out soon. But this is really, we actually, the USDA NAS did their first ever local foods marketing survey in 2016, and so we have some more data than we've had previously. What I want to say is that when we talk about local food, most people think about farmers markets, but actually local food is divided into generally two different kinds of categories. One are direct-to-consumer markets. So this is a roadside stand. This is like agritourism. You go pumpkin picking. This is a farmers market still, but it's where you're selling the product. Freezer beef is another really good example. Intermediated markets are where you're selling to a school, you're selling to a restaurant, to a retailer, right? But there's something about that product, like that it has your farm name on it or the region that's still maintained and communicated to the customer. So what I wanted you to know about this is that direct-to-consumer sales only represent about a third of total local food sales. The majority of local food sales are in those intermediated markets, and do some research, we see that those intermediated markets tend to be much more profitable for producers than do those direct-to-consumer only channels, just to keep that in mind. So farm to school is an example of local food, right? There's many other aspects of farm to school besides just procurement, but what we see is that 42% of school districts across the country are now participating in farm to school, and that the most common activity involves procurement, right? And within that, we actually see that even though when you look here, so this is milk, 40%, right? So this is the percentage of schools that had local milk purchases. And then you see other dairy is 18%. Even though the number of schools that are purchasing some fruits and vegetables is higher, that if you look at the dollar value spent by schools on local products, dairy is by far and away the biggest, right? So local foods has become big business, right? Walmart set local food goals and they achieved them way before the date they said they were going to. They now say, as of 2015, that they're spending over 700, almost 750 million annually in local foods. We see, not just these grocery stores that are doing it, but also like Longhorn Steakhouse, right? Shake Shack. So really, this has become much bigger business and mainstreams. And I think we're going to see these trends around local continue. And part of this is that we also see that there's been a substantial increase in federal policies as well as state and local policies to support local food, particularly around supporting infrastructure investments and market opportunities, right? So like the program I mentioned through rural development, we saw that between 2008 and 2014, there was over $1 billion spent to support local food. That number tripled in 2015. Specifics on Farm Bill and local food, but if people have questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So we've done some work, as I was saying, at Colorado State University. This is done by myself and two colleagues, Don Thilmany and Ali Bauman. And we've been looking at profitability implications of sales to these markets. And these are actually some market channel assessments we did, and Martha Sullins from Extension was part of this as well. And so what we do is we look at just the costs associated with marketing of these products. And when I say marketing, essentially this is everything that's post harvest. And we haven't done this with dairy or livestock yet. We'd like to. We've really focused right now on specialty crops, but I think there's some lessons learned here that are applicable. The reason we don't do harvest is that the idea is that producing milk, you're gonna have the same cost of production to produce milk, regardless of where you sell it, right? That the cost structure starts to change probably once you finish milking the cows, right? And so that's where we start for these specialty crops. And what we do is we actually work with farms for an entire week during the peak season, which they hate because nobody wants anybody else there during peak season, but it's the only way we can really track labor utilization by market channel. And so here what I'm showing you is the marketing profit margin percentiles. Sorry, this is small here, but we define marketing profit margin as gross sales minus the marketing labor costs minus the travel costs. So just note we don't have complete variable expenses in here, right? This is just some specific costs that we think are the most likely to vary. On the far left here, we have all direct channels. Then we're looking at community-supported agriculture arrangements, farmers markets, and farm stands. So the first thing to note is that for CSAs, there's very little variability in performance, right? Very little variability. People are basically doing similar kinds of things, right? And they have similar marketing profit margins. But if you look at the performance of farmers markets and farm stands, there's huge variation, right? The farm stand piece, we think that this is the case due to that some farm stands are staffed, right? They have people who are physically there and some aren't. And then there's just better locations and worse locations for the farm stand, right? In terms of your ability to generate gross sales. So what this tells us is that if you're in this top 75th percentile, you're doing something well, right? That farmer's market that you're selling at is working well for your operation. And we try to glean what are some of those lessons learned? Because if you're down here in the bottom 25th, you're losing money, right? Because we haven't even included all your variable costs here. So I just want to highlight the reason that we focus so much on labor utilization is that what we see, and this is across all commodities, this is using the USDA's Agricultural Resource Management Survey. Has anyone ever filled that out? No, maybe. Okay. It's one of the, million surveys you get from it's one of the millions of surveys you get from USDA. But this is the best source of farm financial information that we have at a national level. And we started asking questions about sales through local food channels in 2008. So here what we've done is we've taken the entire sample of farms that are selling through local food markets and we divide it by scale, right? So this is under 75,000, 75 to 350, 350 to a million, and a million and higher. What I want to show you here is that if you look at this green bar, which is labor expenses, what we see is that as your farm, your local food operation gets larger, you're using a significantly larger share of your variable expenses on labor, right? So this is the opposite story of sort of traditional agriculture, right? Where we talk about as you get larger, what do? You buy more equipment, right? And so you need less labor on a per unit basis, right? But it's the exact opposite story here. And I think the reason is that what you're doing when you're differentiating your product, right, and selling through local food markets is you're taking on additional supply chain functions. You're doing more of your own marketing, processing, distribution, right? All of those kinds of things, and all of those require labor. It's really important. That's why one of the things I mentioned earlier is that you really have to think about hiring somebody else to do that value added piece because this is just labor intensive, right? There's no shortcut. It's part of why you're getting this premium for this product. So we have fact sheets available on our website, localfoodeconomics.com, if you want to see more of the national level profitability implications of local food markets. And with that, I am going to stop. Thank you. Okay, yeah, great.
We have about 5 minutes for questions if anyone has more.
Oh, yeah.
I was going back to your point number 4 about the importance of identifying market opportunities and supply chains.
Mhm.
What advice do you have regarding how do you do that? Like, how do you find a good feasibility study person? How do you find somebody who can help you do market research? And I ask this because I'm an avid reader of the Dairy Star.
Yeah.
And I've been seeing more and more articles about so-and-so's building a cheese plant to make cheddar cheese. And I think, oh my God, how much cheddar cheese can we get? What are the other opportunities out there? So how do people identify those opportunities? Like what professional systems?
Yeah.
Sort out what's good and what's bad?
So that's a really good question. Yes, the question is how do you identify market opportunities, right? And I think one is that, and I'm sorry if anybody here is a consultant, but there are just not many great consultants in this space, right? And I think, the feasibility study is all well and good. You definitely need a business plan. You definitely have to put the numbers on the page. I don't know that you need a feasibility study. Sorry, I shouldn't probably say that, but that's my 2 cents. I think the best way to do this is to get on the phone or get in person and start talking to buyers, right? And we've been doing these trainings in our state where we've been bringing in, the buyers for a number of the different retailers to talk about what is it that they can't get that they really want, right? Or what is it that their customers are asking for that they don't have access to in the quantity at which they want it, right? So I think that is where I would start in trying to identify some of those opportunities. I will tell you that in some places I see that the way people those opportunities come to them in some respect, right? So they're walking around a store and they notice that there's not a particular product, right, in a store where they shop. And especially as for better or worse, right, increasingly our kids are in urban places, and I think they are seeing some of those trends. So I've seen a number of situations where like a kid went off to college and kind of got an idea and came back to help the parents implement it. So that's what I would say, right? And I'm advocating doing it yourself, but again, you may identify an opportunity for a butter, right? You're not going to necessarily manufacture the butter yourself, but once you identify that market opportunity, then I would get on the phone and call every processor I could on the list to figure out who could co-pack it for me. I would not start by making that capital investment. It's just too risky, right? And you really need to identify that market opportunity first. The other thing, I mean, in the Bruce Rivington case, right? I mean, they knew that they had this creamery made this incredible butter that nobody had access to, right? So for them, we first did a feasibility study about kind of getting this co-op off the ground and things like that. Well, originally it was going to be a co-op, and then when we came to actually deciding what product we were going to produce, it was sort of an easy thing because we had access to this asset.
Anyone, sorry, Jen, anyone besides Jen have a question? Just no offense to Jen. I, she's my favorite, so I just want to make sure her question was last. Jen, please.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to do it. I will just say that restaurants are notoriously risky customers. Restaurants, and we can see this, through lots of data. So restaurants tend to buy really small quantities, right? And they need them delivered at specific times. So like we have a small distribution company that works with a bunch of local farmers in the south part of Colorado, and the only reason that they can sell to restaurants is that they're already distributing to Whole Foods up in the Denver area, and so they can go and do these things. But the restaurants are tough. But I think, thinking about some of these local creameries, maybe they want to shift and start buying local product because then they can sell their product as local. I don't know how your Minnesota Department of Ag branding program works. In ours in Colorado, there's a big discussion that's going on right now. We have the Colorado Proud brand that's anything that's grown, raised, or processed. And there's discussions about splitting that out. New York has split it out already. And actually, what we have heard from our Colorado Department of Ag is that retailers are the one who are asking for it because they find that consumers are confused by the Colorado Proud label because they think it means locally grown or raised, but it actually could mean just processed. So anyway, that's a way that I think you can also work with some of the policy incentives to help. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I would think to really try to think long and hard about what do you see as your competitive advantage, right? And is it that you already have a facility, right, that maybe isn't utilized fully that's right down the road? Or maybe you're in a spot where you can do more agritourism, right? And agritourism, we see tremendous growth in agritourism. It's actually one of the things I should have said about, I think a lot of times people see competition. Oh, this person's making cheese down the road, so I shouldn't make cheese. But actually, maybe you have room for a cheese trail, right? And maybe that's your opportunity. So or maybe you have a kid that is really inspired by culinary, wants to be go and take some cheese training classes. And again, there's grants available to help send them to go and do that kind of training. So I think it's really sitting down and thinking about not just like, our dairy's not doing well, we need to find another strategy. It's like, what is it that we have an asset, right, that's going to make us successful in this venture?
Let's
Okay.
give Becca one more round of applause.
Thank you.